Let me welcome everybody. Let me welcome you to this week's Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm your host, the chief cat herder, and the creator of the forum. I'm delighted to see so many of you here today. We have a tremendous guest on a very important topic, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. But first, let me explain a bit about the forum. Let me explain where it comes from, how it works, who supports it, and then I'll introduce our guest. So to begin with, you should know the forum is a discussion-based venue. This is all about conversation. What I'm doing right now with a couple of slides, I'm only going to do just for a minute, but then it's all going to be about discussion, the exchange of ideas, shared reflections. This is the opposite of what started this off, which was the Future Trends in Technology and Education report. Now, that's a report that gives a monthly trends analysis looking at about almost 90 trends across higher education, looking at the forces that reshape American universities, colleges, and education as a whole. If you haven't seen it, go to ftte.us and you could download a few sample issues. And if you like, subscribe. Now, the FTTE report and the Future Trends Forum are both part of a broader project called the Future of Education Observatory. Now, this is a multimodal, multimedia, participatory, open, and ongoing attempt to grapple with the future of education. This includes the FTTE report. It includes this forum. It also includes a blog, a book club, and a bookstore. If you haven't had a chance to explore that, go to futureofeducation.us and you can learn more. Now, we can only do this work with the help of some very generous supporters. So before we go further, I'd like to thank and recognize them. To begin with, NYSERNet in New York State. That's a nonprofit that helps that state's colleges and universities get on the line with great broadband and do interesting professional development and collaboration together. We're really grateful to them for their support, especially thanks to all the good work they do. We're also grateful to Shindig, because as you can tell, Shindig makes available the technology that we're using right this second. So if you haven't seen it before, let me just walk you through it so you can understand how it works. This is a video conferencing platform, but it has a few interesting twists. For example, where I am right now, and where this slide is, again, just for a moment, is called the stage. It's called that because everyone involved can see and hear everything that goes on up here. Below us on the screen, you can see dozens of people. In fact, there's right now 44 people. Each sign-on, each window represents a single sign-in from a different location. Usually one person, sometimes several people clustered around a laptop or a desktop. And if you'd like to speak to one of those people, you can just click on them, double click on them. And if they want to speak to you and their technology is working, your two icons will click together like Legos. And you can have your own private audiovisual conversational bubble, which is pretty neat. But if you'd like to converse with all of us, if you'd like to ask questions of our guest, there are actually 3 different ways of doing that. And let me show you how. Look at the very bottom of the screen. You'll find a white strip running along it that has a few different buttons. On the leftmost edge, you'll see the number 44, along with a little silhouette of human people. And if you click on that, up will pop 2 different windows. One of the windows on the left will give you a kind of film strip view of everybody who's involved in this video conference. And on the right is a chat box that lets you chat in a classic chat function, basically typing back and forth with people. Now, people often use this to share links that accompany the conversation, or they bounce ideas back and forth, or they just bond with each other. But it's also a good way to try out ideas that you'd like to ask. Now, the only caveats I have on that is right now I can't see the chat. So if you put something in the chat, you want to share it with me some other way. But it's also segmented out into rooms based on people who've logged in. So right now it's broken out into groups of about 19 or 20. And in fact, right now we have 3 rooms. So if you'd like to switch rooms, just look at the very bottom of your screen on each side. You'll see a kind of chevron button. If you click that, that'll let you click over to the next room. Now, the chat works, but there are 2 other buttons I'd like to draw your attention to. Next to that, you'll see an icon of a question mark with a circle around it. Click that, and you'll be able to type in a very quick question or comment. And that's a really good thing to do if your microphone doesn't work, or if your video doesn't work, or if you're not in a place like I am now where you can speak out loud. And I'll get that, and then when the time is right, I'll flash that on the screen for everyone to see, and I'll read it out loud for everyone to hear. Now, if your microphone and camera are working, go back to that white strip next to the question mark. You'll see a raised hand button with a circle around it. Click that, and that tells us that you want to join us up here on stage. And when the time is right, I'll put you up on stage, and you'll have a chance to talk to our guest and myself and anybody else. In fact, up here on stage, we have up to 4 different people at a time. So you can imagine that as a kind of DIY pop-up panel. And again, click on that, try it. It's easier to do actually than it was for me to describe. Now, beyond those three buttons, if you're on Twitter, you can just use the hashtag FTTE. And that is something we'll be monitoring throughout. And we find that people will sometimes tweet if they're in this conversation right now, they want to share with the world what they're seeing and hearing, or sometimes people who can't make it, but say they're in a car or a bus and they want to fling us a question. We've already seen a few of these come up. So use Twitter, but within Shindig, use all those different methods to approach us and to hold the conversation. We're really grateful to Shindig for making available the technology. And we're also grateful to our fans and supporters on Patreon. So if you haven't seen this before, let me just bring that up. This is a way for people to crowdfund a creative project. It's like Kickstarter or GoFundMe. And in this case, the project is the Future of Education Observatory. So we have more than 110 people who contribute as little as $1 a month just to keep the lights on and the machines running. So I just wanted to celebrate a few people who contribute more than anybody else. People like Paul McConaughey, Christopher Downs, Michael Haggins, Bob Johnson, Chris Lott, all kinds of wonderful people. Matthew Henry, we're really grateful to them for their support. If you'd like to join them, just go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander and you can find out more. Now that's who supports us. That's how the forum works. That's where it came from. Now let me introduce this week's awesome guest. I'm just delighted to be able to introduce Robin DeRosa. Robin is one of the champions in the world on open education. She has for years worked to help build up open education resources, to investigate and promote open pedagogy, open teaching and learning. And she is right now in a great position. She's the director of the Open Lab for Teaching and Learning at Plymouth State University, New Hampshire, and a professor of interdisciplinary studies. What we're going to be talking about today is open, where open can go, where it is now, how you can support it, and what it might become. So let me welcome Robin DeRosa. Greetings.
Greetings. Can you hear me?
Perfectly. So glad to see you. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Let me just see if I'm getting an echo. Hold on. Nope. Sounds great.
No, sounds really perfect. Sounds like that's the voice of an experienced video conferencing person.
Right. I've got earbuds if we need them, but otherwise I like to roll free.
Oh, I understand. So let me ask, one way I get people to introduce themselves is to ask them what they're going to be working on for the next year. So, through the next fall and winter, what looms largest for you in your work?
It's such a difficult question coming after those debates last night. I'm really trying to figure out, I guess I'm feeling this looming sense of urgency. And I want to make sure that the stuff that I'm focusing on is not just sequestered in the area of my own expertise, but is really connected to what I see are just very pressing national problems. So what we've done here at Plymouth State is we've started up a new collaborative that's very, very exciting. That's taking a lot of my time and energy. But I think for the next year, my goal really is to take that work and to support the people here who are doing local work and to figure out how that we can link that to larger national pressing issues so that if we do some things that are helpful to students and to teaching and learning, that we're really sharing that in the service of a broader vision for accessible public education. So I think that's my goal, is to be working locally and thinking globally, which is, basically an old school bumper sticker, but still an effective one. But at the new collab that we've started, it's called the Open Learning and Teaching Collaborative. And it's really about helping faculty, staff, and students rethink the pedagogies that we want to power higher education, and to have those pedagogies emerge from learning communities rather than from outside the institution or sort of other pressures. So that's the project.
That's a huge project. How will you carry this out? Will you be doing consulting with faculty? Will you be doing workshops? Will you be creating media? Will you be going outside in winter and building elaborate snow and ice castles? I mean, what will be involved?
I know you are at heart a Vermonter, so there will certainly be lots of ice castles, sometimes right here in my office where the icicles seem to grow off the sculptures behind me. But I think what we're really working on in the collab is a learning community model. And luckily, when you say, how will you do that? Mostly my answer is, if it's something I have to do, I can pretty much guarantee it's not going to get done. So the goal, I think really with all of the work in Open, is to figure out how to create ecosystems in which the wide variety of good people that we have can have their work amplified and shared in ways that allow us to share the work a little bit more. So what I'm really focusing on is, how do I galvanize a learning community? How do I take the people at my own institution who have, this is nothing new. Open education is nothing new, but also these kinds of pedagogies focused on agency and connections and transdisciplinary partnerships. We've got people doing all that work. And what I'm trying to resist is the sort of innovationitis that says, look, this is brand new, and if you hire someone to come in, they can show you how to do it. And instead, we're trying to grow that organically. And I see my job as being more of a barrier remover for the good people that we have who are doing good work and trying to facilitate relationships. Given the sort of austerity of public ed and the pressures, there's a lot of competition and a lot of fear and a lot of conservative clenching. And I see my job as offering a sort of more open and generous alternative, and helping faculty feel empowered in those models in particular. And so that's my goal, is really to build a learning community that extends from my institution to my system, to my state, and then nationally.
How big is the system? How many institutions?
So it's one of the beauties of New Hampshire, of course, maybe like Rhode Island, for example, that's had some really nice success with OER in particular, is that because we're so small, we only have 4 USNH public institutions. I intimately know my colleagues at these institutions now that we've been building this out. And also we have 7 community colleges, and we have been reaching out with those community colleges as well. So last year we started the New Hampshire Open Education Public Consortium. And because we are a small state, we're able to get all 7 CCs and all 4 USNH campuses, and pretty easily bring all those people to the table. So I was at the Board of Trustees meeting this morning for our system, and property.
Friends, I have more questions for Robin, but I would like to make sure that you get a chance to ask your own questions. So again, if you look at that white strip in the bottom of the screen, either type away in the chat box, but then click the raised hand if you'd like to share a question for us, or click the if you'd like to show up on video, or click the question mark if you want to type in a question. We're covering a lot of ground, and I'm sure you'll all have some. To begin with, I'd like to ask a bit about this. What does radical sharing mean in 2019? When on the one hand, we have so many technologies for sharing, and we have so many building practices for that, everything from Creative Commons to just people being more habituated to it. On the other hand, parts of the online environment are more and more frightening, where we have more trolling, perhaps more abuse, and a lot of fear about that. How do you balance those two domains?
Yeah, I think part of this, especially in the open community, has been a really fruitful conversation over the last year or so, influenced by people like Mahabali, who I'm working with right now on a project where, and actually Audrey Waters has a post particularly about this that's really affected me. But when we think about open, I think it's important not to think about it as another innovative panacea, but instead to think about it as an orientation towards practice. So when we think about radical sharing, it's not about the artifact that is shared. It's about the values of building a commons. Jim Luke is another person. He's a economist at a community college, and he writes quite a bit about sort of the values that undercut a healthy commons oriented, like a healthy knowledge commons. And that's not really about policing the sharing of stuff. That's really about helping people understand what it might look like to work in a more circular or sustainable system. A lot of this is about resisting some of that older school sort of economic philosophy about the tragedy of the commons, right? What will happen if we overgraze this meadow because we share it with everyone? Well, we only overgraze a meadow when the commons is about the grass, right? And not about the relationships between, I guess not so much the cows, but the farmers. I get lost in my own agricultural metaphors. So what I'm really interested in is not so much, how do we make a low-cost textbook or what, but I'm really interested in, more radically, what would it look like to think about higher education as a sustainably public ecosystem? And that's when, we start thinking about questions about infrastructure, not just what we've produced. We start thinking about how we're producing it, where the money trails go, what our sustainable circles look like. And, I was very influenced, I know as you have been too, by Christopher Newfield, talking about some of the ways, and you see this in open access research too, right? If you look at the flows right now of where the money goes and how we make our cases and how we relate to each other, there's all of these places where we're just starting to see breakdowns in the system. Yeah. So for me, the question is not so much about saving money in a particular place, but rethinking that whole ecosystem towards a public good that really works for everyone. And that's why, there's a lot of crossover with the debate last night and trying to think about health care and trying, these are all related conversations for me about how we nurture and care for each other and what mythologies we've been fed about why more public sharing systems don't work. How much of that is a PR game that has, tricked us a little bit.
That's hard in a state like New Hampshire, given its politics.
Live free or die, baby. Yeah, it's hard. And also I want to come at this through practice. Like I'm not an economist and I'm not a policy wonk and I'm not really a consultant. I'm really a teacher. So the question for me has always been, I'm glad those people, that Sarah Goldrick-Rab is doing her research, and there's Philip Trossel at UMaine, and like people are doing great stuff. But for most of us who come from a discipline or an area of expertise, and we're just working with our own students, what does it mean for our practice, and what kind of larger questions should we be asking as we do our own local work? And I'm trying to bring these conversations, to more faculty, to more staff, and especially to more students, and not just keep them in the sectors who have traditionally owned these conversations.
I asked people to supply their own questions, and the questions have just been coming in like mad. So let me just bring up to the stage Peter Wallace. Peter, you're muted. You need to unmute yourself. Hang on one second. See if we can connect. Hello, Peter. Can you hear us?
Hi, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Perfectly. Good.
Wonderful. So first off, Robin, thank you so much for your work. I've been following it for a long time, or at least since you were first publishing blog posts on collaborating with your students. And I really love that aspect of your open pedagogy work, not just, providing things for free, but really opening up who creates the work. So my question is about that. What really good examples are you seeing now of tools and structures for those collaborations, and maybe not just with students, but with a broader public, as you're saying? And then the question of who gets money for that, if there is money in it, or publication recognition, or that kind of work, I think becomes really complicated, especially when you start inviting more people into structures that are traditionally about single authorship or framed that way, right? Thank you so much.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions in your question.
Totally. Right. Sorry.
And all good ones. The first thing I'll say is on the tool question, like what tools are helpful for doing this kind of collaborative work with students and helping students work in ways that really make them contributors to the knowledge commons rather than consumers. And I'm sorry, things keep dinging because my dad is like texting me every 5 seconds about something. I don't know why. Dad, if you're watching, stop texting me. So what I will say is, like, what I've become aware of the more I've worked with students is that it's really important to de-emphasize the tools and instead to think about what is the purpose for students contributing in various ways. And the purpose of contribution is not actually contribution, period, right? It's not an inauthentic thing that you're just doing for the sake of offering this to students. When they contribute, they're actually really contributing valuable things. It was a mind-blowing lesson to me when I worked on this open anthology of American Lit with my students and realized that the thing we worked on had real value for an external audience. So part of what I think about is talk with your students and your staff support and ask, in what ways will the work that your students do really be an effective and helpful and creative contribution to the knowledge commons, and then what tool will help them do that. And so for me, in my work, a lot of that has been domain of one's own. And literally, I'll just start weeping if I talk about the fact that I just hired Martha Burtis to come and work here in the Open CoLab. And that's because we have discovered that for the work that we do here, two of the tools that have helped us most are domain of one's own and Pressbooks. So domain of one's own has allowed us to build what in my program, which is a customized major program that's been just growing astronomically over the last 4 years. It's an open pedagogy oriented program, and we use domain of one's own, and we talk about those sites as e-ports, which are very different from the e-portfolio drag and drop model. The idea here is these are portals or ports of call where our students can interact with their scholarly and professional communities of practice, which are very different, one student from another. And their e-ports are very different, one e-port to another. And so for this customized major program, that makes a huge amount of sense. But I'm working with other faculty colleagues who, for example, teach foreign language, and they're working on some sort of Canadian border stuff about Francophone culture up here in New Hampshire. And so they're building with their students more like traditional broadcast websites that offer resources and learning materials for French language speakers in our community outside of academia. So for them, building that kind of web tool. We have other faculty who are building press books that they're making available online that are kind of like textbooks, but really they're full immersive experiences. They offer, multimedia stuff, student reflection. They get remixed over different semesters by different sections. So I think the goal is that when you talk about student contribution, it's really important to authentically know that your students have a lot to offer to the publics around your institutions, and to choose tools that help them do what they do. And then, of course, there's the other part where I'm constantly trying to ask, okay, in a larger question, what's the back end of this tool look like, right? And the hybrid pedagogy folks are really great for this. Is this an open tool? Is this a nonprofit tool? If it's not, how does it link with the larger vision that you have for this open project that you're trying to launch? So really I feel like my job is to talk with faculty and students about their learning objectives, and then the technology comes later. And I always, at this point, sort of facetiously say, like, I'm an early Americanist, right? Like technology is, I don't know. Every time I need to know something, I just watch a 12-year-old kid on YouTube teaching me how to do it. So it's less the tools and more the question of what does an authentic contribution in that field look like? And I see my colleague, Matthew Cheney, who is the director of interdisciplinary studies, which sits in our co-lab. In the chat, he's putting some examples of some of those e-ports that exist for us. And then, Peter, you had another question.
Please.
What was it? It was good.
Yeah, well, I think the pair. Thank you very much for that response. I think the pairing with that is the question of, as students make authentic contributions, and hopefully as we start to invite the public to make authentic contributions to the scholarly literature, how do we create reward structures that recognize and motivate that kind of productive engagement?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And part of what I go to on that is like, hey, faculty, this is in some ways not a thing that is done to us, right? This is a thing that we do to ourselves. And the problem that we have with contingent labor in higher education, the sort of elitist orientation of everything from the high cost of our academic journals and those kind of paywalls, to the promotion and tenure system, to the adjunctification of the labor pool, all of these things I consider to be part of my commitment in open education to call out, address, and work around. So when I don't have a lot of patience. I mean, I model patience, but internally I don't have a lot of patience about arguments like, I'm sorry, I have to publish in X journal for impact factor, or really a lot of that is about educating our faculty colleagues, and particularly the ones with the privilege of not just tenure, but healthcare and benefits and stability, to understand how the elitism of our system is also bad for the knowledge commons and bad for research, bad for all the things that we pretend that we stand for. I'm very influenced at the moment by Kathleen, is it Fitzgerald? Somebody put it in the chat. Kay Fitz, because that's what she is on Twitter. Her book, Generous Thinking, which is interestingly I think she barely mentions open education, open access a little bit, but really what she's calling for is a more radical way of rethinking sort of intellectual property and elitism and competition in higher education. And instead to think, if what we care about is research, is learning, all of the sort of things in our mission statements, that a generous orientation is going to meet those needs a lot better than these sort of proprietary competitive models.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that great question.
Yeah.
And
thank you. Yeah, I'm sure plenty of other people have lots of questions. So, but we could keep talking about these things all day. They're important. Thank you again.
And I will. I'll just keep talking all day. Good. So good luck to you with your questions, people.
And on the nice beard, Peter, too. Always glad to see that.
Working on it.
Let me just bring up very quickly one question from, let's see, this is from, let me bring it up here. This is Scott, University of Washington, said, you mentioned radical sharing and radical something else. Something else.
Radical X. I don't know, but what I like, Scott, is Radical X. And I think we can just go with that as a model for all things. Radical openness, AK is suggesting. What I want to point out, though, is when I say radical, two things. First of all, I don't find any of this radical personally. But second of all, I don't mean extreme. So, for example, my MIT is copyrighted. Yeah, oh my God. Anyway, I could go on about what's going on in the chat right now. So not only do I not think these things are radical, but I don't mean extreme. For example, I am not a person who believes all things open all the time. A good example of this has to do with indigenous cultures that have been continually appropriated or exploited by white academia. And so there's a different political framework of power when we sort of radically open indigenous texts. The same thing, there was a really interesting case that Tara Robertson has written about when On Our Backs, which was like a pretty radical lesbian sex magazine, I don't know, like in the 70s mostly, I think, 80s, I can't remember. Whoever knows, tweet it out. We want to know who's reading the radical lesbian sex magazines. But when they decided to sort of digitize and make those available, there was a really interesting question about, did the people who participated in that work have any sense of what the internet was going to look like and what it would mean to make those things radically open, right? So again, this comes back to me, not to the sort of radicalness of being extreme in our points of view, but it's really about resisting and challenging a sort of neoliberal sense that it is just natural and right that everything should be about revenue generation and about profit, and that the only way that we can sustain ourselves is if we privatize and tap into quote unquote a market culture. And I think it's radical at this moment historically to resist that. And that's what makes openness radical, not so much that you're saying everything open all the time.
Kind of an economic alternative to neoliberalism. We had a question from the awesome George Station, who needs to unmute himself.
Hi, George.
Hi there.
Hi, George.
Okay. And am I coming through okay? Because I'm not on earbuds here. Great. So my question is kind of back to your earlier discussion of the commons, and it just came to me: how do we make sure that we're farmers and not cows? And so that's the core of it. But it's kind of coming from, we're both in public state systems, and I know New Hampshire is not California, but we're rather hierarchical and top down. And I'm wondering how you have been, at least so far, navigating that successfully. We got a kind of a nasty lesson through executive orders out here and our general education and so on. And I'm not sure that it aligns well with what you're talking about with the concepts of open. We do pretty well with, I think, the open textbook side, that kind of affordability argument, but not, I don't think we've gone beyond that yet. So anyway, how do we, are we farmers and cows? Does the metaphor hold up, or does it totally collapse?
I mean, I think there's a risk here in enjoying this metaphor too much. Yeah. And I see people in the chat claiming their cowness, I think, with a sense of pride. I don't know about that metaphor, except to say this, especially for students, they have absolutely been cows. They have been herded through their education to the point where there are whole retreats that faculty have to try to figure out what tap dance we need to achieve in order to make a student just care about the education that in many cases they are just paying gobs of money for. Yeah. That is actually weird to me when you think about it. So part of the sort of cow farmer thing is really about thinking about learning, not as a thing that is done to you, but is there are only cows, right? There are not cows and farmers. There are only cows. And the question is, how do we all participate together and get our students to have the sense of agency that will truly make them the lifelong learners we keep sort of spouting off, that we want them to be somehow miraculously when they graduate, they just get that, right? So that I think that agency question is really important. It's very interesting, the top-down thing. I mean, in some ways, some of the places that have more luck with open are very top-down systems. Like, for example, I've been working with the university system here and the community college system here. The community college system is much more top-down for actually really problematic reasons, right? For example, they have just enormous numbers of contingent faculty. So they have a smaller number of people making the big decisions about, say, textbook adoptions, and then they're just sort of given to the faculty who teach in a certain way sometimes. So even though they have that, so what happens is that top-downness makes a kind of speed that, for example, the chancellor of our system wrote an open textbook with Flat World back in the day. So he's on board, and and then all of a sudden, off we go. And what happened is they just leapfrogged right over the university and moved very quickly. That's a double-edged sword, right? That kind of agility and quickness is also because, in a top-down system, there's a lot of exploitation, and I'm not sure ultimately what model is more or less sustainable. So I think the preference for me, because like you'll often see this in legislatures now, right? They want to pass resolutions to force systems to do OER, which on the one hand sounds great, right? Like, when was the last time you had what's good for students, what's good for parents, what's good for faculty, what's good for administrators, and what's good for legislators all aligned? But on the other hand, if we only see this as a cost savings measure, we run the risk of not understanding and not being able to discuss or delineate between the difference between cost savings measures that are absolutely crippling teaching and learning at our institutions and cost savings measures that are actually good for teaching and learning. Because cost savings alone is generally not, just by itself, a good way to make decisions. So I think no matter how quickly or slowly you have to move, the most important thing is to help people understand that what matters is students connecting with their educations. What matters is college completion, right? Students who don't leave college unless they want to do something else, right? That they're able to stay and persist and succeed. And also a research commons and a sharing network that allows for information and ideas to flow to as many diverse communities as possible globally as well. And I just think we have to, if we don't center those conversations, it actually doesn't matter how fast you move on OER. I think in 5 or 10 years, we're all going to be using OER. So don't stress about it. If you're school slow, just wait, because soon they'll be behind and they'll have to do it and you'll be done. But that alone is not going to save us. That's just textbooks, man. Like, we got to think more thoughtfully about that, right? And I'm like lecturing George, who is, just one of the key people who works on this stuff all the time. And well, the trade-offs that you get when you've got contingent labor that you can, move more quickly in certain directions, right? Yeah. So sometimes being slow is okay, because what it means is you've got more stakeholders at the table and you're doing harder work to build a coalition. There's a lot of things moving really fast right now in education. And sometimes I'm like, well, and Stephen's saying maybe the system as it is isn't worth saving. I vacillate on this, but one of the things I think about is institutions, right? So the system is a vague thing, right? We don't know exactly what we mean when we say the system. But one thing I really think about all the time is, AK just asked that same question. What do we mean by system? Well, just think about a public institution, a university. Mm-hmm. Is that worth saving? And this is what I think. Yeah, institutions. Stephen says, yes, that's what I mean. So what I think about that is, dude, we don't know, because no one is talking about the value that those public institutions offer and what we will lose if we lose them. And that's the Chris Newfield case, right? That we need to understand better what the thing is that we're giving away right now as we rapidly privatize these institutions, or as we reject them and go instead for some. In New Hampshire, we have New Hampshire University, SNHU, doing a lot of incredible access-oriented stuff in a private nonprofit model. But we don't know what we're losing if we succeed at SNU and let the public institutions in New Hampshire die, right? Those conversations are very quiet right now. And I'd like to try to be a larger voice for that question.
Great. That's wonderful. Thank you. And yeah, and preaching to the choir a little bit, but thanks for that. I'm wondering, before Brian kicks me off here, you mentioned several people along the way early on in your discussion today across our virtual networks, right? That are all wonderful people. I'm wondering if you've been able to do that kind of network growing locally as well. And I'm also at a small university. There are a few people here or there who are kind of into this whole discussion. We seem to have a little trouble connecting, but virtually here right now, we're doing fine. So I'm wondering,
that as I look at this participant list, there's a lot of big names in Open that I talk to on Twitter, and I'm so honored and excited to see them in the list. But and I really try not to be teary. The people in that participant list who are making me the most happy right now are the people who are in the room right there. So hi Jess, hi Matt and Sue and Phil. There's a whole bunch of them in there. This is new for me, George. The building nationally was a learning community was much easier for me than building it in my local context. It's actually my keynote at Digital Pedagogy Lab is focused on why we have such a hard time translating huge successes in consulting or outside work into our more local contexts. And I don't believe that's coincidental because a lot of people will talk to you about this. Okay. I think this is part of a kind of outsourcing model that exists right now with a devaluation of the human resource and the communities of our own systems, our own homes. And that's very intentional, and it's part of why things are fragmenting and eroding. So the collab and some of the work we're doing with the learning community, my colleague Kathy LeBlanc got a grant from Davis to focus on community building around pedagogy, and this work, in my opinion, is the thing that's the most exciting in my career, is seeing the people right here come to the table to work in a specific place with specific students together. And that's the change that I think is really going to be impactful. It's really hard.
Okay, great, thanks. And we'll compare notes later because of the workshop that I'm assigned up to do at DigPed as well. Yeah. So we need to chat about that a little bit later. Thank you. Thanks, Brian.
Oh, great. Is Brian gone and now I'm running this show? Literally, you guys, Brian just disappeared. So I've been promoted, and I think Tara, the admin, just sent me a private message that says, ha ha. So if that makes you guys feel comfortable, he's getting refreshed right now. And I can't even answer any more of your questions because I can't see him.
Can you hear me, Robin?
I can, but don't do that to me again, Brian. It's
I don't
stressful.
Didn't lose anything on this end. Did I just go blank for a second, or did I vanish?
You vanished, yes. You went black.
Ye gods, I don't know how that happened. Well, I'm sorry about that, but I'm here and I'm back, and we have more questions for you. And in the meantime, I'm wondering if we should adopt "Don't be a cow" as our official motto. We have another.
Or be your own cow. I think that's it. Be your own cow.
Oh, I like that. I like that. We have a great question from another friend, Tom Hames. Hello, Tom. I think Tom should be in Texas this afternoon.
Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Hello? Okay. All right. I don't want to milk the metaphor any more than I have to. So the question that I had put into the chat thing, and I'm really interested to see your response to, is the problems you're describing are not new. I mean, this has been a product of our system since at least the massification of higher education in the 50s and 60s. What makes you think we can change it now?
I'm sorry if I implied that I thought that we could change it now.
Well, no, obviously you're working hard, and we all are.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to see, because you've talked about systems, and these are things that I work with an awful lot, and that I'm very interested in. I'm a political scientist by training, so I'm into figuring out why large groups of people do stupid things.
Yeah.
But you've talked about systems. Do you see an opportunity in the present that didn't exist 10, 20, 30 years ago? And what is creating that opportunity that wasn't there in 1990?
Yeah, I mean, so I obviously can't like fully answer that question, but I do, and I am watching Stephen's pessimistic chats roll in, because what Stephen is referring to there now is like there are folks like Kathy Davidson, like Christopher Newfield, who are sort of making, or Kathleen Fitzgerald, did we decide? I don't know. Patrick Fitzpatrick, who are basically arguing that if we talk about public value, that kind of education is going to be able to help us shift systems. And so Stephen's sort of taking issue with that, saying, I don't think it's a perception problem. I guess for me, it's also comes down to daily practice. So every single day, as just a teacher, right? Like up until recently, I more or less had a 4-4 teaching load, and that's all I did.
Yeah.
And every single thing I did was a choice, right? So I was always making choices between OER and an open textbook, between this platform and that platform, between how I spoke at a committee or not. I'm on some service committee that's kind of annoying because I got to go to all these committee meetings. What are we doing? Well, we're talking about whether we want to contract Student Success Collaborative and use predictive analytics with our students. And right, so just as a regular old person in higher ed, I was having 100 touches a day that were involved with these deeper questions about what public education is supposed to be. And I don't know what it's going to change, but I knew that most of the decisions I was making were not being made thoughtfully. I wasn't aware of all of, I was aware of early American literature, and I was aware of like how I was connecting with my students. But the question of the system of how higher ed and how it runs was not my field as far as I was concerned. And I think the big transformation for me was in thinking, look, if you are in higher ed, the question of what higher ed is and should be, that is your field. And I don't care if you're a physicist or an instructional designer, or you work in the cafeteria, or you're a student, or you teach math. All of us have to be engaged critically with these questions and be empowered to offer a point of view and think about solutions. And right now it's a very tiny number of people who are engaged in those conversations. So I don't know what's possible if we engage more people, particularly our students, I think, who are very powerful, because right now we have a customer is always right model. And I'm a little interested in what happens if the customers, if the cows get upset about being herded and the customers get upset about being treated like customers. So that's really the model I'm operating on, is like, let's just wake up a little bit more and be a little more critical at every level of our daily practice. And then maybe we'll see what ideas we come up with. But right now we don't have enough people in the game, to be fruitfully asking these questions. I mean, most of the people I encounter every day at my job, these aren't on their radar, and they weren't on mine for 20 years in the classroom. So That's my best answer.
So you don't think you can't point to any one specific thing that may have changed that has shifted the fundament in your case in terms of how your perception on it?
No, I mean, most every year that I do this work, I feel like it's getting less hopeful, to be frank.
Wow.
You know, so I don't feel like we're almost there, folks, or anything like that. What makes me hopeful, though, is the fact that when I rethink my own practice, I can make decisions every single day that are transformative for the little piece of the system that I work on. So, you know, just in terms of the assignments I design and the technologies that I use and the things I say yes to and the way that I choose to spend my privilege and my gravitas, I'm throwing all of those behind a more generous approach. And it certainly has had impact. You know, like I worked for 20 years in the old model and no one ever asked me to do a shindig before. You know, like people are interested in listening and it matters, but I don't think there's a thing that's made it like there's not going to be a thing that fixes and we're not on the cusp. The more it is, it's really about how the public thinks of itself as a public. And, you know, if the public wants to be a private, then that will be that. Right?
Do you think the problems are more visible now? Is that what's causing you to?
I don't know, because I live in a bubble, right? So in my world, yes. Also at my institution, yes. 3 years ago, I could not have opened this lab. The reason I know that is I tried and he said no. Today, I was at the board of trustees talking with the education commissioner for my state, and every president and provost from the state of New Hampshire was there. And I was the, you know, featured speaker with my team from across USNH. So, you know, I guess I feel like if enough people who actually are in the game doing the work are concerned with this stuff, it takes a long time. And usually we get beat up and chewed up and spit out before we can keep going. You know, that burnout is real. I had a couple years where I was just like, yeah, you know, I thought
hear you.
As long as we don't all give up this is what I said at an event the other day. And as long as we don't all give up at the same time, you know, it's okay. Like I gave up, honestly, for a couple of years I did, because it was too damaging psychologically to be working on this stuff. Now I feel more hopeful. And what happened is when I took a couple of years off, I realized before I left, I had planted a little seeds and they were growing when I was gone, you know, and they germinated. You know, and this is, you know, again, Stephen in the chat sort of talking about public institutions versus privatization. The question of learning inside versus learning outside the institution is very interesting to me. And I'm not at all convinced that institutions are the way to do this. But I know that once we lose them, we're not going to be able to go back and get them back. So I want to be very sure that we've done everything that we can to understand the value that we have here. And I teach, of course, every day in a very small regional public rural university. And there's a lot of incredibly special things that happen here that, you know.
As I said in the chat room, complex stories do not have ends. Yeah. So, you know, thinking that you're going to get to the, and I told this to my students literally this morning, that, you know, thinking that you're going to get to the end and they all lived happily ever after is a figment of the analog world of novels that have an end of the book. So you got to keep fighting. Thank you. I'll sign off.
Thank you very much, Tom. Tom's another great friend of the program.
And that's why I think talking about like pedagogy and practice are helpful. Yeah. Because they're not completion-oriented models. You know, it's different than talking about OER and an artifact and a thing you can either do or not do.
It's practice. And speaking of which, we had a great question that came in on Twitter, or rather an observation from Juan Domingo, and I translate this as best I can from given my very bad Spanish. He said, it's a question that if education is public, we would understand that it belongs to everyone on a state or a private level. But on the other hand, if education is social, then it's personalized and socializing. And I thought, that's a really interesting dynamic to put out there, and in part speaks to what I think Tom was going after. Why are we talking about this now? And it seems that, to go back to what you were saying at the very beginning of this hour, Robin, that we're in a different time. And there is a lot more on the table. There's a lot more concern, and we're rethinking a lot of the big questions.
Yeah, I think in what you just said with Juan's question there too, that's interesting. And this is not an answer to the question, but just the idea of the role of the personal has become very vexed with personalized learning, I think. And the relationships between sort of neoliberalism, competition, and personalization, right? We think of personalization as something that's empathetic in some ways, right? Like, I'm going to personalize this to you because I care for you. But at the same time, the models that we've got for personalization right now are very competitive models to a certain degree. And they're not, they preclude sort of collaboration, and we will not hold you back. We will not let the people hold you back. You know, you will get to go forward. And I wonder, you know, there must be some other option, choosing between the personalized and the collaborative. There's a way to sort of honor difference and sort of the idiosyncratic, while also building true communities, right? True coalitional communities. So I'm always thinking about that, because some of the sort of most distasteful things seem now to be called personalized, or in other ways like inclusive, or the language isn't always what it purports to be, I think. So anyway.
Thank you, Juan, for the really, really good question. And I wish I could respond to you in Spanish without making us all both laugh ruefully.
Well, Beto O'Rourke did it. I feel like, you know, your Spanish is probably.
But contrary to Tom's assertion about ends, we are approaching an end. We are somehow almost out of time this afternoon. And I wanted to ask you one last question to kind of wrap things up and push forward, which is, where do you see this entire open ethos headed in the next, say, 5 years? Do you think we'll flip and have, you know, the majority of textbooks open? Do you think we'll have a majority of faculty practicing open, or is the road longer than that?
I'm going to say textbooks. Sure, that's an easy one, and I'm going to say yes. It looks like it. You know, and that's why I sort of relax with my people here. I'm like, do it, don't do it, I don't care. I think everybody's going to do it. It'll be fine. But, you know, that's not really the most interesting question to me. The question of open is a much bigger question, involving so many things, from open government to open data, open science, and open access to research. And, you know, all of these things competing with increased austerity and competition for resources and privatization. And I don't know what's going to happen with any of that. The main, and luckily I'm not a futurist. I'm a nowist. And so in the nowist perspective, I think it's not really about not looking ahead, and it's certainly not about not looking back, because I think the history of how things move is really important. But I really think people in higher ed can spend a lot more time looking at the things we do, right? The practices we engage in every day, and just start there. And you don't even have to start doing something in particular. You just have to start looking at them and asking why you do them, and asking your students, why are you doing them this way? So if I had a hope for the future, it would be that when we talk about rethinking education, that won't be in the hands of some fancy startup or some politician. That will be in the hands of people who do teaching and learning and research and scholarship. And those people will work together with their communities to figure out a thoughtful way to teach and learn and grow. And if that's not, you know, an institution, it won't be an institution. So we'll see. I believe this concludes this episode of the Future Trends Forum, now that Brian has left us yet again, awkwardly. I'm looking to the chat to see if people have wonderful parting words. But I think one thing that'd be funny is if we all just left and Brian came back and we were gone.
That would be very depressing.
We're still here, Brian, but I'm going to throw it back to you because what if you disappear again?
That's very strange. And my apologies for that. I'm not sure what's happening, but I will talk to Fios. Robin, thank you so much for being a fantastic, fantastic guest, and an inspiring one and a deeply engaging one. What's the best way for people to keep up with you?
My website, which is just robinderosa.net, has links to my social media. So if you're on Twitter, you can reach me that way. But it also has email links. And I'm pretty accessible, just hanging out here in New Hampshire. So people can figure out the best way they like to use. And I'm happy to try to help with whatever you're working on if I can.
With or without cows.
Right.
Thank you again so much. We'll have to follow up with you next year as we see what happens to your ongoing work. And thank you again. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks, Brian.
But don't go away, everybody. We have just some closing notes, and let me just thank you all for the really, really good questions. This is a really moving session, I think. Next week, we're going to shift focus to zoom in on what happens to academic freedom in the future. We're going to have Professor Henry Reichman, who has just published a book on where academic freedom is headed. It's obviously a hugely important topic, and I really look forward to your thoughts and ideas then. We finished our book club reading of Zubov's fantastic book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. We're getting some requests for our next reading, so please share with me your thoughts for what we should read next. If you'd like to find any of these books, including the ones that Robin DeRosa mentioned today, head to our bookstore. And if you want to keep this conversation going, we're all over social media. Please join us. In the meantime, once again, thank you all so much for your excellent conversations. I think this is a great session. I really appreciate learning and hearing from all of you. Until then, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.